All right, let's get started. Hello, everyone. And again, thank you for joining us today. We're going to get started with the actual webinar in just a few minutes, but first we wanted to make some introductions and brief announcements. My name is Ari Kornhaber. I'm a former personal injury, medical malpractice, and mass tort trial lawyer, and today I will be your moderator for this webinar session. And today we will be covering bold growth, smart money strategies for contingency fee law firms. Our guest speakers today are Chad Dudley, serial entrepreneur and partner at Dudley DeBosier Injury Lawyers, and Gary Falkowitz, president of Intake Conversion Experts, also known as ICE. Chad Dudley started Dudley DeBosier Injury Lawyers with his partner Stephen DeBosier and James Peltier in 2009. The firm now has over 50 attorneys with offices throughout Louisiana. Additionally, Chad is the CEO of CJ Advertising, an advertising company that represents personal injury law firms throughout the country. He is a nationally recognized speaker on the topics of law firm management, marketing, and technology. It's an honor to have you, Chad, with us. You are an incredible thought leader, so thank you for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Mr. Falkowitz is the president of ICE, Intake Conversion Experts. He's also the owner of Maximum Intake Consulting and founder of the Falkowitz Law Firm, PLLC. Gary has been an attorney for over 16 years now and has separated himself in our industry as the leading expert on intakes. ICE has signed over 100,000 cases on behalf of hundreds of law firms nationwide. Moreover, Gary has consulted with hundreds of law firms. He has focused his career on teaching attorneys the importance of effectively creating and managing an efficient intake process that maximizes the return of a law firm's marketing investments. Gary, it is likewise an honor to have you here. I've heard you speak, and the passion and subject matter expertise you bring to the table is unmatched. So we could not have a better panel today. So I'm looking forward to getting right into it. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. So as we carry on our discussion, we will be polling you, the audience, with questions related to the conversation. Now, these polls are completely anonymous, so feel free to participate. And they're really here to make your webinar experience more interactive and more fun. So to get you all familiarized with how this works, let's start off with a sample icebreaker question. You want to fire that up? Here we go. What is your primary intake strategy for growing your case inventory? That's a good one. That's one that we're going to be talking about a little further on in the webinar, but great icebreaker question. Again, these are completely anonymous, so feel free to participate and answer. I don't know if the answers are going to pop up, but either way, they will during the actual webinar when we're getting into the conversation. So when we launch these polls during our session, they'll be open for approximately 2 minutes at a time. If you want to participate, keep an eye out for those pop-ups. Now, questions and answers. There's a Q&A window that we will be monitoring throughout the session, and it looks like digital marketing and TV advertising were the most popular responses to the sample question. So back to the Q&A. If you have any questions, we highly encourage everyone to put them into that Q&A window. And we'll pause several times during the session to address them. And don't worry, if we don't have time to answer one of your questions, we'll be sure to send you a message privately. And lastly, let's talk about the chat. There is a chat window which will be open for the duration of our session. So if you have any comments that you would like to share, that's the place to do that. So that wraps up our housekeeping items. So let's get started. Chad, I want to kick it off with you. From an up-and-coming tennis star to a tennis coach to being the first in your family to even go to law school to today, running one of the most successful law firms in the country, and on top of that, a successful marketing agency. Could you share with the audience a little bit about your origin story and how you find the time to do all of this so well?
Well, I appreciate that, and I love what I do, first and foremost. Yes, I wanted to be a professional tennis player when I started, grew up in Hawaii. And interesting thing, there was an attorney that sponsored our team. He funded us to get coaches, to get trainers, to actually travel and play tournaments outside of Hawaii. And he was a plaintiff attorney. And that was the first time I was going, man, what does he do? And learned more about it and just fell in love with the concept of representing the underdog, fighting for people that can't fight for themselves. And just, I looked into it more when I got a scholarship to go to the Nick Bollettieri Tennis Academy. It's now called IMG. When I was there, Andre Agassi, Pete Sampras, and a bunch of others were down there training. I quickly realized that maybe I wasn't going to make it as a professional tennis player, but maybe I can play in college. So I went to LSU, had a scholarship in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, played for the team for 4 years, had a great experience there. Took a year off, taught tennis for a year, decided I wanted to work inside, maybe where it's air conditioned. It gets hot in Louisiana in the summer, and decided to go to law school. Got my law degree, and my first job out of the gates was managing a mass tort, toxic tort up in North Louisiana. There's 4,000 plaintiffs, and I was in charge of answering discovery. And I learned how to create databases, program, create reports, measure metrics, et cetera, et cetera. And that kind of led me down this path of the data side, the management side of the law practice. And I've been doing that ever since. I started Dudley DeBosier in 2009 with my partners, and it's grown, like you said, to over 200 employees and 50 attorneys. And we have an ad agency that represents about 45 firms across the country and generating cases. And during that time, I started Vista Consulting with Tim Mackey. We provided consulting to plaintiff law firms all across the country, worked with about 100 plus firms on all aspects of running a law firm. And that was a awesome experience. And during that time, I got to work with Gary Falkowitz. He was working with the firm. He ran their intake center, just did a kick-ass job with it. We hit it off because we're wired very, very similar. We always are looking to make things more efficient, to improve, make it better, and we obsess over it. And so Gary and I hit it off, and fired up to be here today and to be presenting with him in this forum. So thank you for having me.
Truly our pleasure. Thank you very much. So Gary, over to you. Like Chad, to say that you keep yourself super busy would be an understatement. You're an author, a lawyer, an entrepreneur, and again, the most renowned intake expert in the nation. So we would love to hear a little bit about your origin story and whether you and Chad are taking those same vitamins that give you so much energy.
Yeah, so on any other webinar, I'd be the one saying that I'm the tennis player, but I can't win that battle here. I mean, I played Division III tennis at Brandeis, and that just doesn't hold any water in this webinar. So I'll move away from that. But no, Chad's right. You know, we are definitely wired similarly. I didn't realize until later in my career, and by the way, thanks for having me on, Ari. This is great. I love talking about this stuff. I realized later in my career that I fell in love with filling the white space, right? It was if I fast forward to after being an assistant district attorney in Brooklyn, New York, and after doing medical malpractice defense, I became a personal injury attorney. It was there where I realized that there's this whole business associated with in the industry. And not many lawyers, paralegals, obviously, or others were really thinking about the business side of things. And when I realized that there was a business side, and I jumped into the intake, and I was on TV as the face of the firm. That was a few pounds ago, by the way. But I realized there are little things you could do on a daily basis that can have a significant impact, not only on morale or on success, but also on the numbers, on the revenue. And once I realized that, it was sort of foot on the gas, and let's see how far we can take this. I ended up leaving the firm, consulting law firms on intake, opening up my own call center, getting involved in cases with other law firms, and Chad and I, we work great together, hand in hand about whether it's business wise or intake wise, and couldn't be happier to be on this call today. So thanks for having me.
No, that's awesome. Thank you for sharing that with us. So Chad, back to you. We're all tired of talking about and hearing about the pandemic, but what we saw was that the pandemic drastically changed the landscape of the contingency fee legal market, from stay-at-home orders, fewer people on the road, to court closures, to the time that was created for attorneys to do an introspective of their business and how they either needed to make some changes or ignore it on their business operations, to capitalization and investment. From your perspective, you have such a unique perspective. What have you seen in terms of the change that law firms have incorporated throughout the pandemic? And what do you think a healthy looking law firm looks like coming out of the pandemic?
Well, pre-pandemic, a healthy looking law firm for me was a firm that had, 25% or higher net profit, was growing in terms of revenue, profitability, intakes, new business, maybe 15% year over year, 20% year over year in some extreme cases. And I like firms that had zero operational debt, totally okay with case cost debt, because I think actually case cost debt is good debt. It adds value to your cases, the cases that you're handling. We've noticed at our firm when our case costs are actually increasing, that we feel better. We're getting more surgeries, getting more procedures, getting our clients' cases are getting worked up. We're hiring experts. And so I'm okay with that. But no operational debt. And I'd say like a healthy law firm looks like that. And to get there, you have to have a good partnership with a bank that understands your business, right? And so, and sometimes that's difficult, but you got to do that. And what happened is during the pandemic, one of the other things I'd say is that a lot of the law firms that are healthy have access to either line of credit, cash, or some vehicle for the rainy day, right? And the rainy day came big time with the pandemic. I mean, it hit a lot of firms that were probably very, very confident in their position in the market, saying, hey, we're successful, we're killing it. What could hurt us? Well, world pandemic comes in and calls drop off. Some people lost employees, and everyone handled it differently. What I noticed was you had a group of firms that just basically gave up or just stuck their head in the sand and said, just tell me when this is over. Some firms shut down. Some firms laid off half their employees. Some firms just did nothing and said, well, just whatever happens, happens. The firms that I was impressed with looked at it and go, you know what, this is almost an opportunity, because we haven't been in fear of our existence forever. I mean, we've been around forever, and we're faced with a catastrophic event that could impact our ability to go forward. What firms that were successful during that period did was use that energy to get a lot of stuff done. I can tell you at our firm and other firms that I communicated with, things that we've maybe been trying to get in place over the past 6 months prior to the pandemic took us 2 weeks, because everyone was like so hyper focused. I mean, making sure that we do these things to survive. Other firms did the same thing. And so they kind of came out of this pandemic better than they went in. And now the other thing is that they had to focus on operations and making sure that they absolutely did not let anything fall through the cracks. You had to get hyper vigilant on intake, making sure that every single phone call, is it a case you're going to handle in-house? Is it a case you're going to refer out? Getting those contracts in the door. Was it important before? Absolutely. It became 10 times more important during the pandemic that you don't mess up intake. Also, how you handle the cases. Are you maximizing value on your best cases? And what I saw, again, the firms that made it through without letting anyone go, that made it through and thrived during this period, focused on those things: intake, maximizing value on their existing cases. And then now, as we're kind of coming out, there's some different things. People are having to answer the question: if I'm hiring people now, do I give do they work remote 3 days of the week and in person 2 days a week? Because that's what the market wants now. Clients that were fearful of interacting, like signing DocuSign and doing stuff remotely, now it's just the way the world is. It's even better. And so there's things that have become easier, but then there's also still some challenges. But the firms that are looking at these challenges and treating them like opportunities are really coming out ahead.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I know you and I have spoken about this at length in the past, and you've mentioned sort of I think it's called a ranking system, in terms of ranking your cases and ranking your attorneys to make sure that the right cases are with the right attorneys. As you just stated, you could get more out of your existing inventory by focusing on some of those items. Could we go under the hood a little more and share some of those
absolutely.
strategies?
I mean, our and this sounds crazy. I mean, since 2009, our average fee has more than quadrupled, which is a crazy journey. And And we sat down the other day and we asked ourselves, what were the things that we think made a difference? And we listed out all the different things we had done over the years that made a difference. And what we found is we didn't necessarily do them in the order that if we could talk to another firm and say, here's the order you should do them in, it was all jumbled up. And the thing that we figured out was the most important thing to do first was counterintuitive to a lot of people, because you step back and you go, okay, well, legal operations, what are we trying to do? We're trying to get the cases with the highest potential to the best attorneys and give them the support they need to get the best results. I mean, that's basically what we do as a firm, right? So you need to know which are your potential best cases and who are your best attorneys as a start. And that sounds super simplistic, but what we did is we developed a rating system for attorneys. There's 5 different tiers. The short version is tier 1 is you're fresh out of law school, you never handled a plaintiff case, or you're coming in from another practice type, never done personal injury work. You're green. Tier 5 is you can handle any case, anywhere, anytime, lead attorney. We have total confidence in your ability to get multi-million-dollar result or something along those lines. And you got the other tiers and how you get from one. But every attorney at our office is ranked. And what does that do? It is agreeing who should the best cases go to, right? We all agree that that's in the best interest of the client. The ranking system that we developed, and there's, a lot of different ways firms rank cases, and there's a lot of faults with how those cases get ranked, and they unintentionally hide great cases in the firm. And you say, no way that happens at my firm. It absolutely happens at your firm. I've worked with too many to know otherwise. And the ranking system is based on a simple concept. Pareto, and you'll hear me talk about this all the time. Pareto was an Italian mathematician that said 20% of your effort creates 80% of your results, right? And so in most firms, 20% of their cases generate 80% of their revenue. And being super tuned in to what do those cases look like and how do you spend your more time, effort, and energy on those files than the other files. Another thing, your top 5% of your cases generate 50% of your revenue. I mean, that's crazy. If you have 100 cases, 5 of those cases are going to generate 50% of your revenue. What do those cases look like? How good is your firm at identifying them and getting them to your top attorneys? Because I tell you what, you can give one of those top 5 cases to a tier 1 attorney and a tier 5 attorney, and you're going to get 2 wildly different results. And so if you're not good at getting those cases to them as soon as possible, as soon as identified, you're going to run into issues. And finally, for firms, their bottom 20%, their 20% of their worst cases only generates 1 to 2% of their revenue. And a lot of places, attorneys tend to work on all cases equally, and they're not equal. They're not equal. Does every client deserve the best representation we can possibly provide? Absolutely. Are there cases that require more time, effort, energy, and attention to get the best result? Yes. And that's what the system is designed to do.
It's a great system. It sounds like the foundation for the successful law firm to be built on top of. Thank you very much for sharing that. I see guests are asking for a recording of this webinar. It is being recorded. We would be happy to share it. You will get a link to this webinar after it ends, probably in the next day or so. So, Gary, you and I have spoken at length about the intake process and how crucial and critical it is for lawyers to get it right. You've identified black holes, right? So let's get under the hood a little bit there and say, well, now that the pandemic has sort of catapulted law firms into this digital age, what have you seen in terms of trends when it comes to law firms and how they approach intakes now that, hopefully the worst is behind us?
Yes. So something that I was saying before the pandemic is now being listened to and heard post-pandemic, which is you got to dig deep and look at the numbers. Law firms are spending all of this money just to make the phone ring, right? They have no idea if the people who are calling you are going to be qualified claimants, if they're going to end up signing with your firm, if they're going to refer your firm to somebody else one day. So if you don't have a process whereby you can see, okay, what's my cost per lead? What's my cost per qualified case? What's my conversion rate, right? Conversion rate. Everyone hears that term so often. Sometimes you hear it from a marketing perspective. Other times you hear it from a law firm perspective. I want law firms to start thinking about, well, if I got 100 leads and 50 of them qualified for retention, what percent of those that qualified did I ultimately sign? Now, you'd be hard-pressed to learn that on average, for personal injury firms nationwide, it's probably close to about 70-75%, which is, first you might say, oh, it's not bad, it's 3/4. But that means you're leaving 1/4 of your qualified cases on the table. Where should that number be? If you're marketing with a brand in your own jurisdiction, that number should be over 95%. Right? A lot of law firms don't even know the number. They're not even looking into saying, hey, how good are we doing at intake? Guys, this is one of those things when you think about post-pandemic, we have to be more efficient. For many, many law firms, if not all of the law firms, the number of leads that came in diminished significantly. So what does that mean? How do you ensure that you can meet or exceed the revenue or the number of signed cases from the year before? And the answer is, well, we have to do a better job at vetting them. We have to do a better job at following up with the law firms, with the claimants. We have to do a better job at using our digital and our technology to convert a claimant into a client. And I think what law firms are starting to understand is when you talk about outsourcing, I think they're finally becoming comfortable with the idea that if I can't do it really well myself, I have to consider other options, right? Whether it's Chad's marketing company. There are plenty of law firms that have been doing the marketing themselves. Are they doing it well enough? Maybe now it's time to think about outsourcing that or having someone come in and make sure they're meeting certain standards. You talk about the money that you need to gamble in this industry. Is it smart money or are you throwing money away? Right? If money comes in, are you using it just to make the phone ring and you have no idea if you have enough staff on the nights or during the weekends to ensure you're following up? I mean, these are the questions that I think every law firm began to ask themselves and hopefully not just asked, but sought answers. So it's very interesting. I think law firms are running much better now than they were 2 years ago, and I'm excited about that.
And Gary, you made a great point. You think about that. A firm gets 100 leads, right? And they want 50 of them are qualified, but they're only converting, 75% of those, right? And you're leaving say you leave 10 cases, out there that you could have gotten that we're going to provide that you could have represented. So 10 cases, and we know about 75% of them will actually make it to the finish line with the fee. So say 7.5 cases of those would have made it to the finish line with the fee. Say average fee of $10,000 for simple math. You're talking about in a month, maybe $75,000 on the table, and you multiply that by the year. And then what happens is, and I joke about this, but say firm A doesn't get those leads, firm B gets those leads. You're talking a chunk of money they're putting in their war chest for the upcoming year. Now, you hope they go spend it on silly stuff, right? But a lot of them don't. They're going to put it back into advertising. And then the gap between those two firms just gets wider and wider. And after 4 or 5 years, it's two totally different firms. And that's how much it can impact you on a day-to-day, on a month-to-month, on a week-to-week basis. And it's a big deal.
It's a huge deal. Chad, I'll just follow you up for a second or follow up with you, which is, law firms now, it's no secret that private equity is getting into our industry, which only means that things are going to become even more competitive. There's this, I like to use this funny term, I call it the blackjack mentality. You don't have to play blackjack to understand the mentality. In blackjack, you assume that the dealer has a 10 face down. Well, I like to tell law firms, I want your intake staff, and it's what we do at ICE, I want you to assume that every claimant that reaches out to your firm has reached out to 2 other law firms. So what can you say? What can you do? What technology do you have to make your firm more attractive than 2 other law firms? Because if you take the mentality that you're entitled to every lead that contacts you and that they contacted you because they only want you, then you're going down this path of leaving a lot of money on the table.
Yeah, and that's a great dynamic because even if the person doesn't have a viable case that honestly no firm would take, right? We've had situations, and I've seen it with my consulting clients, of going, the way they handled the rejection, the compassion with which they tried to, handle the call, that person told other people about that experience. And when they had a viable case, they came back to that firm because of how that was handled. So handling the ones you want, handling the ones you refer, and handling the ones you reject in a professional, on-the-ball way has a ripple effect on the growth of your.
Big time. I'm sorry. No, I'm sure Ari wants more to add here, but I got to say one last thing about this, which is so crucial. I think law firms fall into the trap of thinking that once they get a client, it's one and done. and they only have to worry about that client that they sign and getting the most money for that client. What we forget is that because we're a business, we have the potential to create such an amazing client experience with that claimant, regardless of how much money or regardless if we reject that claimant. There's an experience that we provide that starts with intake and could end when the case resolves, but starts with intake, whereby that claimant will either become a detractor or a promoter of your law firm. And that is 100% to you, the lawyer, to your law firm. If you don't have that personality that you're conveying that is top notch, if you're not putting out that red carpet, that white glove treatment to that claimant, whether you can help or not, then you might be having a significant negative impact on that claimant and what they say to their friend or their neighbor down the block who needs a lawyer. Oh yeah, I called that firm. They were so rude to me on the telephone, I would not call them again. Or I spoke with them, they couldn't help, but they told me I should call in the future. They were wonderful, they were sweet. They told me about the pizza place that I go to. They know it well. You should definitely call them, right? There's a big difference based directly on the relationship that your team can have with the claimant.
You know, Gary, it's funny. Yeah, I did want to chime in, but it was precisely what I wanted to bring up to you because I know you focus and you teach other law firms to focus on the customer experience and not just at intake. I know that you promote speaking to your clients more often than you do. Getting to know your clients better will, number one, provide a better customer experience and actually help you achieve a better result. So I don't know if you want to touch on that a little bit more, but I know how passionate you are about that.
I'll say one aspect of it because I don't want to be a broken record here. At ICE, we've handled many intakes from many law firms. What we see, unfortunately, is that many claimants will become a client of a law firm, and then they won't hear from somebody for weeks on end, sometimes months on end. And what do? Ari, what do, Chad? They call another law firm, right? While they're retained or while they've retained your law firm, they call another law firm. They didn't even tell you about it because they thought maybe I didn't really retain that law firm. No one called me. No one told me I'm a client, right? That's the most basic mistake that we can make as a service provider, and that's what we're doing. We're providing a service, a legal service for these clients, to not treat them as a friend, as family, as someone that we want to be a promoter for us would be such an absolute horrible mistake for the future of your law firm, that you need to have systems in place, not just at intake, but maybe at the opening, maybe throughout the process, throughout the client relationship, to check in and make sure the client's getting everything they need, make sure all their questions are answered. Because what we forget, and we have to remember this, it'll be the last thing I say about it. What we forget is that claimants most likely never needed a personal injury lawyer before. Never. They never went through this process, right? We go through it 100 times a day, 500 times a day, new client check, new client check. They have no idea what the next step in the representation is. They have no idea what to expect. So if we could provide that roadmap right at the outset, hey, here's what to expect, here's when to expect it, and we're here if you have any questions, that prevents them from looking elsewhere. And we've got to think about that as a law firm.
100%. We talked about how we grew our average fee over the years, and going back and first thing you do, you got to rank your cases based on your Pareto point and your super Pareto point. Number two, you got to rate your attorneys based on their skill set and experience and the results that they've obtained. Number three is start a valuation committee. Set that aside for right now. But number four is client communication. Does your firm have a clear plan for how often and who is going to talk to the client? Is it every 15 days? Is it every 30 days? Is it a firm that, hey, I talked to one of my consulting clients the other day, and they wanted their lead attorneys were saying, well, we don't need to talk to them that much to work their case. And I said, yes, you do. Then I explained, the relationship that you build, specifically in the early part of the case, in the first 90 days, is so critical. I recommend that firms talk to their clients at least every 15 days during that first initial phase of the case, that they should, both the attorney and the legal assistant on the file should have a in-depth conversation, first interview within 24 hours of the file being opened. Okay, and then they talk to them, and you're trying to get your arms around, okay, what kind of client am I dealing with? What are their injuries? What is where's this case going? And it's so critical, especially in those early stages. And so firms that don't have a client communication plan are at such a severe disadvantage. I mean, it's crazy. We've seen client communication cuts down on gaps in treatment, it increases average fee, It increases the number of referrals you get from that person. It actually reduces time on desk. So you have all these great things. And the number one complaint against attorneys by their clients is client communication. That every bar, I don't know, it's some crazy stat on bar complaints. 80% of them are based on client communication. So it's easy. It does a lot of great things. So many firms overlook it.
Truly amazing and so easy to do. And you think about the customer experience today and what their expectations are today as compared to maybe just 5 years ago, because of technology, because of the way people live their everyday lives when they're deciding which restaurant or hotel to go to, online reviews and things like that. Everything you're talking about has an immediate impact and a forever impact. So it's so interesting to think about that. Chad, I wanted to ask you about the valuation committee because you and I talked about it in the past. You briefly touched on it. It has to do with your ranking system. Could you give us a little more detail about that in case other firms want to implement something similar?
Absolutely. So as soon as you have more than one attorney in your office, right, there's the possibility that those two attorneys are going to look at the value of the case differently. And that problem only exponentially increases every time you add another attorney. And I would argue, even if you're one attorney, you should go bounce the value of the case off of somebody else outside your firm. But the point is, when someone sets a value on a case that they haven't discussed with anyone else, you can kind of get in a bubble and lose your bearings a little bit. The concept is, if you took 10 attorneys and gave them the exact same case, facts, injuries, liability, etc., and said, tell me what the value of this, you'd have some might say it's worth $250. You might have some people in your firm that say it's worth $70. And that gap can be crazy. And the person that pushes the value the hardest at your firm, I call them the person who's the highest risk tolerance attorney in the building. Who's the one that pushes those values? And I would argue the valuation committee is designed to get that person to set that type of value on all the cases above the Pareto point. Now, I threw a lot of topics there. So if a firm's Pareto point is $50,000, what that means is cases where the gross settlement value is $50,000 or more makes up about 20% of their cases and generates 80% of their revenue. And it's a little bit different for each firm, but most firms it's around the $50,000 range. Get your attorney with the highest risk tolerance to set the value of the cases that are above that Pareto point. Yes, they could do it below the Pareto point, but again, that's 80% of your cases. You can get bogged down. Just focus on your top 20%. And what that does is it's crazy. I've seen firms like literally this one concept double their average settlement, like that. This one thing. And so the way the valuation committee works is someone comes in, they present the case, the attorney it's not a democracy, not everyone voting on the value. It's the person that you designate as having the highest risk tolerance. It could be more than one person. It could be a couple of people that have the ability to get great results, but they set the value. Okay. And so you cannot go below this value without coming back to this committee. Right. And now sometimes they'll set a value. Sometimes they'll tell the attorney, hey, look, this case needs additional workup. This client's still treating. Go hire a life care planner. Go get an economic expert. Go get a voc rate. Go do these things, and then come back, and then we'll set a value. And that dialogue, typically it happens on a weekly basis, has a crazy effect on the results you'll get for your clients. I promise you.
Awesome. I mean, again, what a great opportunity when intakes were down for most firms on this webinar today to find other ways to increase the law firm's revenue, concurrently. It's just brilliant. So, Gary, how often should a law firm be looking at their intake process and determining whether or not changes need to be made? Everything that you and Chad are talking about reminds me of what we tell law firms that we work with about planning, being prepared, and being proactive. So someone may be listening to you today and deciding to make a change. How often do they need to revisit their current process and potentially continue to evolve?
Daily. I mean, every hour. I mean, it's interesting because Chad was just talking about almost making the standard higher, right? If you think the case is worth here, like, hey, make it even higher. See if you can meet it. With intake, it's almost the opposite from signing cases. What I've seen, and I talk about it whether it's with my call center or I consult with a law firm. What I've seen is that law firms are scared to sign cases that are not certain to resolve. And that's a mistake. That is a major mistake in our industry. You spent all this money, the smart money, right, that they're borrowing from you likely, and they're putting it out in the marketing world, and the phone rings, and then you're just saying goodbye to all those claimants that are not the low-hanging fruit, that are not the easy to resolve. Though, first of all, I'll say 2 points. One is every law firm I've ever met has made a huge sum of money from the maybe cases, from the cases that might be something, right? That's number one. Number two, if we could change the standard from let's only sign cases that are certain to resolve to let's only sign cases that are likely to resolve, that could resolve. If we change that standard, we get to sign more cases. Now, yes, that will result likely in rejecting some cases post-retention. But isn't it better to retain than reject as opposed to never retaining at all, right? A little Garyism in there for
I like it. When I'm working with firms and trying to find that sweet spot for each firm, it's a little bit different. There's some firms that, hey, look, our model is we receive leads from attorney referrals, and this is how we do it. And other firms are like, okay, we get leads from these sources. Some firms go, hey, look, we only want to carry, each attorney's going to carry 20 cases, but they're all going to be worth over, $500,000. And other firms go, our criteria is that, if it's liability and injuries are there, we're going to sign that up. So you're trying to find that sweet spot for each firm, and to each firm their own. One way we calibrate it and go, okay, did we make good decisions? And a lot of firms don't do this, is not only look at your intake data, but look at your closed case data, right? If you close 100 files, how many of them closed with a fee, right? And okay, well, is that okay? Is it low? Is it high? For auto, most firms close about 75% of their cases with a fee. It means 25% you shut down, you open it up, shut down, no fee, took a hit, whatever. And what we look at those, what was the time on desk for your closed, no fee cases, right? How long did they stay in the system? If it's a month or less, sign them up. You're efficient. You're able to get them out quick. If it's 6 months, if it's over 3 months, I get concerned, right? But if you're hanging on to these bad cases for 6 months, you don't have the operational system to do it. I would say err on the side of maybe being a little bit more cautious on intake. If you're able to get them out of the system quick and identify them, err on the side of signing them up. Now, the other part of this is when you take the cases you close with no fee, you put them in 3 buckets. Okay, the first bucket is, you know what, we should have never opened this up and we should have identified this at intake. So let's go modify our intake criteria so that these never make it in the door. The second bucket is, you know what, we should have identified this, sooner in the first 90 days, and it took us too long, and we should have done this on, week 1, day 30 to find that this was a bad case. And then the third bucket is stuff happens. That's the kind way to say it, but just stuff happens and there's nothing we could have done differently. And that will help you modify your criteria for intake and your early case procedures. But yeah, I mean, each firm's a little bit different in that regard.
I'll say,
Gary.
You're right. I agree. And I definitely come from the perspective of, hey, let's be aggressive here, guys, because we spent the money marketing. Why not investigate this case a little bit? Which leads me to a different point, although similar. Too many law firms are investigating a case prior to retaining the client. And it's a big mistake, right? You got to 100%. Right? You got to make this really appealing for the claimant. Imagine telling a claimant for the first time that they need a lawyer. They're in an accident. They went to the doctor. They got some back issue, and they say, "Listen, all I know is the other guy came out of nowhere and T-boned me." Right? And the law firm says, "Well, listen, can you get us that police report so we can look at it before we sign you up?" No, I can't get you the police report. I'm going to go call the other law firm that said they'd sign me right now while I'm speaking with them on the telephone. Do not investigate pre-retention. Ask your questions. Figure out what you need to qualify, but retain to investigate. Don't investigate, then retain.
Yeah, don't give them homework.
That's right. That's right.
You know what? If you want us to represent you, go do these 10 things. I mean, it's just, if you have any interest, err on the side of signing up.
Right.
So watch those closed case stats to see if you're efficient in getting the bad cases out of your firm. Because think about it. If you're working if your close with fee ratio is maybe 70%, that means 30% of the cases you're opening up don't generate a fee. And if you're working on those cases for 9 months, that means you got team members that are busting butt working files that aren't generating fees, and that's not good.
Or they
So,
just
Chad, in
ignore
your
the
role
file, right?
as a consultant, when you meet with a law firm, how many of them are doing that, looking at their closed files and trying to learn from them? Or is that something that you're teaching?
So here's how it typically goes down: is that when I work with a firm, there's a couple of tools I'll use to audit how efficient they are and how healthy they are, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things is I'll look at their labor ratio. How much money is spent on compensation for employees and all in benefits, everything. And what is that ratio to their revenue? And if that ratio is high, right, like they're spending a lot of money on labor and it's not generating equal amount of revenue or a proportionate amount of revenue, I'll look at their closed no fee statistics, and almost all the time they're opening up a bunch of junk they're working on for a long period of time. So everyone feels busy. Everyone's like, I don't know what else I can do. I can't work harder. I'm working like crazy, but they're just working on cases that don't produce fees, and they're working on them for a chunk of time. And so we'll try and rein that in to get the labor ratio under control. Make sense?
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. There was a follow-up question regarding your ranking system from an audience member, so I don't want to overlook that. At what point in the process do you rank your cases? And are you ranking them by injury, by coverage, a combination of the two?
This is a great question. And again, you'll hear me say it, ranking your cases, and it sounds like, I don't mean to take away from all the other things that we do to work a file, but at a macro level, case ranking is one of the most important things that we do. Again, having worked with a bunch of law firms all across the country, there's firms that were consistently getting just great results for their clients. And when I interviewed their attorneys, I noticed they looked at cases very differently than firms that had smaller value cases. And the number one thing they did is when the case came in the door, they asked the question, why is this case not worth policy limits? Versus a firm that handles maybe smaller cases goes, all right, day one, this case is worth $0. Okay, they treat for a month, now it's worth $2,500. Now they treat for another bit. Okay, their medical expenses are this, times it by 3, or goofy stuff like that, right? And they're going from a 0 value up. The top firms go from, this is a great case, tell me why it's not. Okay, so the ranking system that we set up uses that concept. When a case comes in the door, we rank it as a B. Day one, we know nothing about the case. It's a B. What does a B mean? We believe we're going to treat this case like it's above our Pareto point. We're going to treat this case like it's $50,000, worth $50,000 or more, and has the potential to be a great case. An attorney that has a B, we call it killing the Bs. We try to do it at 90 days. And by that time, we've talked to the client a bunch of times, possibly have a diagnostic test in our hands, MRI or something along those lines. We know more about property damage, liability. We know some stuff about coverage, right? We know our client's coverage. We can get an idea about the defendant's coverage. And we take all these factors and we try to answer one question at 90 days. Is this case above our Pareto point? It's worth more than 50, or below our Pareto point? It has no chance of ever being worth more than 50. So if it's no chance, doesn't matter who handles the case, best attorney in the world, we'll never get more than 50 on this case because of length of treatment, because of what other issues, it gets moved to a C, less than 50. The other ones go to an A. All we're saying is it's worth more than 50. And then at that point, further down the road, we're going, is this a super Pareto point case? It's in our top 20%, but is it in our top 5%? Those get ranked as A pluses, okay? And now you're going, well, that's great, but that's super vague. Yes, it's vague, but those buckets make sure that those cases get in the hands of the right attorneys. All you're trying to do is get the cases with the highest potential to your best attorneys. Doesn't mean they're going to knock it out of the park every time, but give them the right circumstances time and time again. Now, when a demand package, the first demand package is getting ready to go out, at that point, that's where it goes. Cases B or higher go in front of the valuation committee, and we'll do limits demands. I mean, you're like, well, you don't know the limits, and and it may sound silly if it's a $10 million case and a $10 million policy, and it's a $1 million case, and you're asking for limits. I get all that, but we do a limits demand. Before they come off limits, they got to go and get 2 numbers from the valuation committee. The first one is the minimum settlement value, what is the lowest amount that we would recommend the client take to resolve this case? And now people say, well, minimum settlement amount, that sounds kind of like, is it like you're undervaluing the case? No. It's a high value that person's going to have to go back to the valuation committee to go below. They cannot go below that number, right? The other value is the top value. The top value is what is our best day in court, regardless of coverage, right? And so you might have a catastrophic injury case. It might be, worth the top value might be $1 million. If you go to trial, you might get $1 million verdict, but coverage might be $100,000. And so the MSV might be, look, if they offer MSV before we can set them up for an excess or bad faith, we recommend the client take that, but it's also worth $1 million. Now, where the gap between those two numbers is the greatest, that's where your top attorneys can make the biggest difference, right? If the top value is $100,000 and the MSV is $100,000, that's an easier case. And so the ranking system operates that way, and it works beautifully. Now, I ran through it. It's tough to cover. There's some nuances, but that's the general concept.
Yeah, let me just tell everyone listening today and in the future that at the end of the webinar, we're going to provide the contact information for all three of us. And if you want to follow up with any of us, it would be our pleasure to speak with you individually. A couple of questions came in about marketing during the registration process. So thank you to those who submitted questions ahead of the webinar today. And Chad, I'm going to stick with you on this one because you know a thing or two about smart marketing and intake effectiveness. I mean, they go hand in hand. So when it comes to smart marketing, what's your take on this?
Well, I think the first, I see a question in here about budget, and people go, well, how do you know if your marketing is working? And again, there's two conversations. If you're getting your cases from other attorneys and referrals and you have a co-counsel agreement, you got to do the math and understand, okay, we only take cases that are worth more than this if we're going to take this type of co-counsel fee, and that's a different conversation. We're talking about cases that come from non-attorney referral sources. And what you need to know is going, okay, if I open up 100 auto cases and do it separately by case, I have 100 auto or 100 slip and fall because the numbers are wildly different, or 100 trip and fall or 100 dog, whatever you handle. And you go, how many of those do I close with a fee? Because if you open up 100 cases and you only close 50% of those cases with a fee, your cost per case almost means nothing, right? Because you say, well, I paid $1,000 for a case. No, you paid $2,000 for a good case because half the cases you signed up are junk, right? And so what I call that number, your true cost per case. Take your cost per case and divide it by your close with fee number, and that's what you're truly paying for a good case. Now, how much should that number be? Well, it depends on what you get out of those cases, right? Now, if you're a firm that is able, your average fee is $25,000, well, you can afford to pay a little bit more for a case than a firm whose average fee is $5,000, right? What's a healthy ratio? I think a healthy ratio is 1 to 5. If your true cost per case is $1,000 and your average fee is $5, then that's great. But it's getting more and more competitive, and anything. Now, look, there's a lot of firms where that spread is way further, but at a minimum, it should be in that range. And you have to know your true cost per case to understand what you're willing to budget for marketing and then for intake.
Excellent. So, Gary, I don't know if you saw the question that came in on the chat, but I'll read it to you. Do you have a recommended process flow or steps to contact, screen, and qualify a new lead? For example, on a web form lead, do you call back within 1 minute? Is 10 minutes okay? And what technology is best to help? How many contact attempts should we make? Good question.
Well, thanks for that question, Scott. That's awesome. So, guys, you know the answer, but I'm going to say it anyway. If you're not responding in the first 1 to 2 minutes of a web lead, your chances of even getting in touch with that claimant will diminish significantly. Now, you might say, come on, Gary, 1 to 2 minutes. I mean, who has the staff for that? Well, if you're getting web leads, you better have the staff for that because intake is required. You need to be able, and it's not just during the day. I just spoke with a law firm that outsources their inbound phone calls to a call center on the nights and weekends and then doesn't call back until Monday. 15 years ago, you could be sitting, have your own solo practice, get a phone call while you're at dinner with your spouse with a new lead, and you tell them, hey, this looks like a good case. Can I call you back on Monday morning and talk about it? And 15 years ago, there's probably a good chance that they'll wait for you Monday morning. That won't happen anymore. There are too many options, immediate options, where claimants can get signed on the first call, which, by the way, you should be offering to your claimants technologically. But to answer the question, yeah, it's got to be within the first 1 to 2 minutes. 10 minutes is not okay, but that doesn't mean you don't call, right? You got to call no matter what. Some people say, Gary, should I call at 3:30 in the morning when they submit a lead at 3:30 in the morning? I would tell you probably not, but I respect it if you do, because they're up and they submitted that lead. And I've been that person who did it for a law firm, 10 or so years ago. To answer the next question, technology, you guys should know there's plenty of CRMs and software out there, whether you're going to go intake, the route of intake, and a company like Captora, or you're going to go down the route of a complete CRM that also has intake. You just have to make sure that CRM has a follow-up schedule in that system, whereby it tells you, and you can manipulate it, when you want the calls to happen. When do you want the second call to be made? What happens if it qualifies? When should that call be made? Something else here is, for a new lead, you should be calling and texting twice on the first day and twice on the second day. And don't give up after day 2. I like to give this silly, although dire analogy, that if you had a friend who's going through a serious gambling problem, right, and they asked you for help, and then you call them a couple of times and they're not picking up the phone, it's not because they got over the problem, right? They might be doing something else, but it's up to you to keep following back up with them, to let them know that you can help them with that issue. It's the same thing with someone who's been injured, right? Just because they're not picking up your first 3 or 4 or 5 phone calls, I promise you they didn't get better in 3 or 4 or 5 days. They either found another law firm, or they're prioritizing something else that's really seriously happening in their life, like their kid is sick or their mom needs to go to the hospital. So please, guys, the timing and how long you follow up with these claimants is so important to ensuring that you're maximizing not only your intake skills, but also your revenue at the end of the day.
Yeah, and we'll call it, like the chase. What's your chase call procedure? If there's a case that you want to sign up that meets your qualifications, what is your map for getting that case in the door? And to give the people on this call some context, there are firms out there that I've worked with that have over 150 planned contacts to follow up on a lead that they want. Now, 150 saying, we're going to text them, we're going to email them, we're going to send them something in the mail for this. And then there's a separate route for if the injury is of a certain caliber. If it's a catastrophic injury case, then they get this packet, and it's got all of our articles about us and this journal publication awards, verdicts, etc. And so just to know what you're out there and up against is that it is aggressive out there, and you have to have a plan. And now understand when there's clients says, stop calling me, or hire another attorney, you got to stop. But they have some pretty aggressive methods for getting cases in the door, obviously ethically compliant, but still persistent.
There's been talk of the technology that the firm should have, the investment in marketing and the return on that investment that you should expect. And, Chad, you mentioned earlier about no operational debt, but debt to finance case costs. One of the attendees today asked about case cost financing and some suggested language for the retainer agreement in case they want to pass through the interest to their client and treat that as a case cost. I have to tell you, from where I sit, it's one of these bold moves coming out of the pandemic. More and more law firms are saying, I don't want to be a lawyer and a lender anymore to my clients. I don't want to pay for my case costs with my after-tax dollars. That's not smart money. I know you've mentioned jumping into this type of debt with 2 feet. And from your perspective as a consultant, what are your thoughts on financing disbursements? And, I find it very interesting because I think it's not understood. You could finance your disbursements and pay the interest yourselves, or finance the disbursements and have the interest calculated for you and pass it through to the clients. There's different options. Either way, it's better than using your own money. It's kind of like the analogy that I came up with. If I said to anyone on the webinar today that you have equity in your home, let's say you have a $2 million home and you have $1 million mortgage, and I said you could borrow $1 million and have someone else pay the principal and interest. Would you consider that? most of them would say, yeah, I would actually become more educated on that and see if it's ethical and responsible and how it works. That's an opportunity for contingency fee law firms. So what's your perspective on this?
But absolutely. It's indisputable. Growth takes up a lot of cash, and you grow your firm by increasing the value of your cases or getting more cases in the door. And both of those things require cash. And so, having a banking partner that understands the business, understands the industry, and understands that, when I work with firms and I go in, they're financing their case costs, it puts a crunch on what they can do to grow their firm in other regards, whether it's, marketing, whether it's hiring another attorney to handle the cases that are coming in the door. It really cripples them. And so we'll look and go, okay, let's free up this cash. Now, we've decided, okay, we're going to disclose to the client where each state has different bar rules, but in our state, we're allowed to pass on a certain amount of interest to the client. Now, we can't earn interest as a firm, even if it was our own dollars. We're precluded from doing that, but we can go to a bank and say, okay, here's the interest rate, disclose it to the client and say, understand that when we incur costs in your case, this is how we're going to be doing it. Are you okay? And 99.9% of the time, it's not even an issue. If it's an issue at any point during the disbursement, often we'll just waive that interest and we'll pay it. But we would not have been able to grow as a law firm like we have without doing it that way.
Great. Well, we're coming up on the top of the hour. So I just want to also let everyone know that the three of us will happen to be in Washington, D.C. next week for the PILMA conference. So if any of you want to find some time to sit down with one or more of us, we all agreed ahead of this webinar to make ourselves available while at the PILMA conference. So I guess, Gary, for you, some last words. I know when it comes to intakes, often lawyers get it wrong. So what are some of those pitfalls or mistakes that too many lawyers are making that are easily avoidable?
You know what, guys? Speed matters. Response time matters. Persistence matters. Looking at metrics matter. Listening to phone calls, knowing what your team is saying, and if they're making some mistakes, I'll tell you, there's never been a phone call that I haven't walked away from and said, damn it, we could really fix that one over there. And that goes for my own phone calls. So I think what the pandemic has done is it has required us, it has forced us to look at things a little bit harder, right? To really pull back the curtain and say, what's going on here? And I think if you do that, you're going to realize that from the day that you spend $1 marketing until the day that a claimant becomes a client, there is so much that can either go right or wrong. And if you're not looking into fixing what's wrong, if you're not looking for the problems, and I beg you, I challenge you to look for those problems, because that is going to make your firm better. And once you start doing that, guys, revenue follows. So good luck out there, and keep fighting.
Great. Chad, your last words. You've obviously grown your firm from the ground up with smart branding and marketing strategies and intakes. Just lastly, when it comes to intake strategies and marketing, what are your closing shots on those two topics?
I agree so much with what Gary just said. I mean, we both worked with firms, and a common trait when doing consulting and working with some really high performing firms is that they're always looking to just get a little bit better. And I can recall a bunch of firms where great firms, very, very well run, just hiring someone in to come and audit their intake processes or other processes. And you find something that gets them 5 extra cases a month, 10 extra cases a month, 20, 30, sometimes in bigger firms. And it has a ripple effect. And so the mentality of we're always learning, we're always improving is a common element of these high performing firms. And so I would encourage you guys to never just sleep on it. Go ahead, look, we got this figured out, whether it's intake, whether it's marketing, whether it's case management. It's constant.
Well, I want to thank you both very much. I've learned a lot. I hope the audience did as well. Appreciate the time you took to have this conversation. I look forward to seeing you both in Washington, D.C. at PILMA next week. So I want to thank everyone from signing in. Be safe, and we will see you next time. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.